Hello and welcome to AUA Focus Series, a podcast channel of the AUA Media Lab. My name is Narine Sarvazyan, and I am William Frazer Endowed Professor at College of Science and Engineering here at AUA. And today our esteemed guest is Peter Coveney from University College of London. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Perfectly.
And it's a pleasure to have you here. And if you don't mind, can you please introduce yourself briefly to our audience?
Absolutely. So, as you said, I'm Professor Peter Coveney. I am fundamentally at University College London. I run a Centre for Computational Science there. We're very big on computing at University College London, so I'm also an associate director of the Advanced Research Computing Centre, which was very recently created. I have a chair in physical chemistry, which is going back to my origins, and I've also got appointments at the University of Amsterdam in the Informatics Institute there, which is computer science, and I'm also a professor adjunct at Yale School of Medicine.
Wow, that's a wild range of institutions. Maybe later on I'll ask you, actually, it's very interesting for me also to know the differences between European and US academic institution in the way it affects your field.
Yes.
That can be questions
to ask. It's an interesting conversation, I think.
Yes, to have. But let me introduce myself briefly. So originally, I got my education in physics, and then I moved closer to medicine and biology because, biology is the physics of the living organisms, right?
Yes, quite.
So my lab at George Washington University for the past 10, 15 years was doing research on arrhythmias, on modeling of arrhythmias, on understanding the blood flow, and developing new catheters which allow us to see inside the heart better than it was possible before. About a year and a half, I was recruited by AUA to help develop biology dimension in the Science and Engineering College and increase the overall research environment here at AUA, which is, I think, essentially for this university to grow. And we welcome people like you who can maybe guide us in the right direction. One of the questions, though, I have coming from experimentalist point of view is when you do experiment, you think you kind of consolidate that knowledge which exists. You make a hypothesis, and then you do experiment. Most of the cases, these experiments do not work. In case if they work, you're very happy. You publish paper, super. But most of the cases, you have a situation where you have to solve a lot of experimental hurdles in order to prove your hypothesis. But the most interesting cases are the ones where you eliminated all the possible mistakes in this long, sequence of possible steps. And then it's still, your hypothesis is still wrong. And I think that's where most of the scientific discoveries actually came from, where people have some predisposed idea, they did experiment, and it just didn't work. Then something new really appeared. So my question to you is that with artificial intelligence, where it predicts something based on existing knowledge, what do you think is likelihood of it being able to actually discover something new?
Then we'd have to be clear what we mean by artificial intelligence per se. I'm not sitting here to suggest that it, in the narrowest sense, is going to solve all these problems. I think just backing up for a few moments about what you described, essentially it's the scientific method in action. And that's what's interesting about the concept of digital twins coming into medicine and having digital twins of the human body, because it's really designed to create a virtuous circle between experimental observations and ultimately clinical ones that are performed on individuals, I stress that, at a personalized level, against a high fidelity representation of what's going on in a computer. And those two things in a digital twin, by definition, must be interacting as closely as possible, exchanging information and data so that you keep them on the straight and narrow path to success, where you described your observations not being in agreement perhaps with some theory or simulation. That tells you need to make changes. Quite often, if you're an experimentalist, you'll be expecting those changes to be implemented in the model, and that might often be true. But it is also the case that experimentalists not necessarily bungle things, but aren't looking at the system in the right way, so they can understand from this kind of virtuous interaction what's a better type of measurement to make that can then be corroborated by a simulation. So really at the heart of what I'm advocating is high fidelity mechanistic modeling of what's going on, because we need to explain what's happening at the level that's relevant to the medical scenario, which could range from the genomic and molecular up to a whole human scale. So it's dauntingly broad. But generally, you will try to pitch your explanations at the scale that's relevant to the measurements that people are making. Because clearly, in the end, that's a shortcoming of typically Western medicine, that it always does what science has loved to do, which is perform reductionism, meaning breaking the problem down into individual parts that are more manageable. But there are lots of problems in human physiology and let's say pathology, where the issues are that there's cross-talk between things at different scales, and can lead to medical conditions that could only be understood at that level. So you do need a global representation, but I'm trying to insist on the importance of mechanistic understanding of what's happening. If something's not working in the model, I can in principle bring in more detail, change the model. The thing about artificial intelligence that you raised at the beginning is, in some ways, it doesn't pay any attention to any of that, because the computer science view is of the experimentalist, and they're very influential with experimental domains where theoretical notions aren't strong. They just tell the domain scientists to generate lots of data, and they will take care of what's necessary in the computer. And what they end up doing, in my summary, is it's a form of statistical inference. They'll get the data from you and match it to observations, and do that with a sufficiently large database that they think they've trained it well, such that the next data set that you bring up for a new patient should be predicted from the trained AI or machine learned system. That's how the whole philosophy of AI works. So it's very powerful when it works, because you've got a trained system that may have been computationally expensive and time consuming to build with all the data, but when it's operating in inference mode, it's essentially instantaneous. It will take data and immediately predict some outcome. It could be through classifying images. So it's got that immediacy that's quite intoxicating, but it completely lacks the mechanistic understanding unless it's forced into interaction with the mechanistic models. And that's another virtuous circle that I'm very strongly keen on, that we see AI rendered more scientific by actively being aware of the, if you like, the theory and the modeling aspects of how medicine works, but not just to take empirical data and draw inferences from them. I hope that was clear.
Well, that was very extensive. But the modeling by themselves, they build based on the known principles or understood mechanism. And that's what I'm trying to kind of, delve into the question whether the really truly novel things can be discovered based on the existing knowledge, or it's only nature which will then face experimentally can tell us.
It's going to be a combination of these things, because I mean, there is a very clear difference. I've experienced it because of the breadth of the work that I do, just in terms of how scientific journals handle submissions to them, publications that everyone who's an academic aspires to, particularly in the higher end journals. If you're working in the physical sciences right up to engineering, material science, it's now perfectly established that you can write papers and are published in prestigious journals that are purely theoretical or modeling, and they're predictive. They say things that don't just explain experimental observations. They will always need that as validation, but they're doing something different. They're making predictions. Now, that then sets experimentalists to work. And I have to only mention, for example, the famous story of the Higgs boson. Peter Higgs made this prediction in the 1960s, but it was in 2010 or thereabouts when the experimentalists at CERN actually found that boson particle. But they had a program of 20 or 30 years to track it down. And in that case, people take the theory seriously. What happens once you get past that kind of midpoint and you go into the life sciences and the medical sciences, it's very different. People are not educated and trained, and this is important in my opinion to transform these disciplines in the way I aspire to understand that it is possible to make predictions in the same way. Whereas, if you take any of the leading journals in those domains, they won't publish anything which is theoretical alone. They insist on the experiment and the data. And if you're going to do theory and attach it to a prominent article, it's always attached to explain after the event. And that has severe limitations for the obvious reason that it's depending always on the experiment being the arbiter that determines whether I do something correctly. However, there are these situations where your theory can be correct, but the experimentalists haven't realized that yet.
I see. So it's opposite situation.
Yes. And what we're pushing for is, with the improvement in measurement technology, digitization, some of it with artificial intelligence to be sure, we can use those methods to make predictions that can then be tested. But we're going further than just testing them experimentally. What ultimately I'm most concerned about is what we call actionable predictions. The best example of those are weather forecasts that everyone pays attention to. Those predictions of tomorrow's weather today are run from very complex mathematical models on supercomputers that provide predictions that, generally speaking, in the short term are correct. And so people make decisions out of it. And the equivalent we're trying to get to in medicine is that we can make predictions of sufficient fidelity and reliability and trustworthiness that medics can take actions based on those, rather than historically, I've got to see the evidence before I act, which will never allow us to do personalized medicine in the way I'm thinking of.
Terrific answer. Very interesting. In my lab, recently we had this interesting idea that the circulation of the blood in the system not only supported by well-known pumps such as heart, movement of the chest, contraction of the skeletal muscle, but there is something which been overlooked for many years, the fact that you have a vein next to the arteries.
Right.
And the arteries are continuously pulsating, and veins have valves.
Yeah.
And therefore, this continuous pulsation of the arterial blood is actually a continuous free source of a way of pushing blood upward to the heart. So I know that you have work in the field of fluid dynamics, including the blood flow and the simulations of the blood flow. And I can imagine that, computer power is strong enough to have a combination of anatomy and, let's say, flow patterns measured by this stuff. But to what degree these models now incorporate the temporal elements, such as like pulsatile flow, or the fact that you have adjacent structures next to it, or you have a, let's say, age relation or other changes, like to what degree we're close to actually mimicking the full flow in the body and be able to evaluate, for example, which of these multiple mechanisms which help us to circulate blood flow have a certain degree of contribution to that.
Right. You're raising a question that's very close to my interests, as you're implying there as well. So one of the research areas that I've been involved in, which genuinely exploits massive supercomputing power to implement, is precisely models of, at the personalized level of the vasculature, which comprises the arteries and veins. So today we are, developing and running simulations at full human scale of the vasculature. To do that, we actually need to run on the world's most powerful supercomputer right now, which is Frontier, which is about 1.2 exaflops. It's a Department of Energy facility at Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee. Now, we have developed a software code that runs scalably across the whole machine, and that does, for a human, provide us with the ability to simulate the blood flow at the resolution of the order of 25 microns across the whole human vasculature. And, at that scale, we're now beginning to address the questions you're posing. I'm not going to try and claim we're in a position to answer all of them yet, but we can demonstrate that it's possible to take a personalized whole human body image and embed it in the simulation. Essentially, it's providing the boundary conditions, and use a fluid dynamics algorithm, which is very scalable, by which I mean as you put the size of the system to larger extent, you can place it on a supercomputer, and that will just continue to support running the complicated system. That's what we mean by a scalable code. So over several years, we've developed such a thing. It runs now with GPUs, so it's really accelerated to a tremendous degree. And as regards pulsatility, that's currently part of the models. We have the inputs with pressure, being varied in the way that can be rendered patient-specific. And you can see the impact of various things across the whole of the body, if it's going from head to toes, essentially there. Now, then you can start asking questions that are global and usually well beyond what medical scientists are thinking about. One example would be magnetic drug targeting, to move a drug to a particular area of the body, maybe for cancer and so on. So you can run simulations of that sort where the particles are then distributed across the blood system, and then see how well you can focus them to get them into the pay zone, as it were. So this is all now happening. You're mentioning other questions that we haven't been able to reach yet because we're just doing these first steps there, and those are to do with aging and other things, because in the longer run, aging is the medical equivalent of predicting climate change. What we're talking about, if you remember my statement about actionable predictions, weather forecasting is tomorrow's weather today. So in a medical context, we can deal with people who present maybe an accident, an emergency. They may need some intervention. Interventional neuroradiologists who we work with have someone who may have a stroke or some malformation that's developed, and they need to treat it, and they may have only one chance to do it. So if you can enhance their decision making by enabling them to run simulations ahead of time very fast and to figure out what would be the right intervention, that's an early win. And that kind of thing is where we're capable of delivering interesting things in the near future. The wellness in the longer term, as I say, is the equivalent of the climate prediction, which would be 10, 20 years, 100 years in the future. It's a different type of problem in a way, but it's still based on what we call probabilistic modeling, because none of the things we do, as in weather forecasting, can be categorically 100% correct. We need to know percentages, and to be able to understand how to keep people in a state of wellness as far as possible. So that's an ambitious goal down the line.
I mean, the anatomy of the cardiovascular system is extremely complex.
Yes.
We all know that the capillary,
Right.
are so small that you can't really see them. But there is also, we still can have some real representation of what we have using current imaging tools, which are
Yes.
amazing and advances in technology. But I think one of the elements which is very hard to collect from the actual human is elasticity of the vessels.
Yes.
Which can vary across the body. If you have plugs, for example, it's going to alter at specific
Yes.
places. So how far we are from combining just anatomical representation of the
Yeah.
vasculature, which with the actually their elasticity and
Yes.
properties.
So, of course, that's a very important question. We know quite a lot about how, for the sort of larger vessels, and by the way, our simulations I mentioned down to resolutions of microns or so are at larger vessel diameters. We treat the capillary bed by a mathematical device that's enabling the blood to be coupled between the arteries and veins in a way that's not resolving everything in detail. But one of the things you may be concerned about is a length scale when the red blood cells, for instance, their size starts to matter. It's not always going to be important. And typically for the larger ones, it won't be, which is a way of me saying to you, as it were, as a physicist, as a modeler, that I don't need that level of complexity for some of what I'm doing. For other areas, I will. So our models do have the capability to include resolution of the red blood cells. It ends up making the computational challenge harder because you end up actually coupling codes together rather than doing one thing, but that's possible. And so when you come to the elasticity, typically for these wider domains, we know it's not such a critical area. We've got studies which show that whether you include it or not doesn't make a big impact. And if you want an answer quickly for an actionable decision, there's no point in making everything as high fidelity as possible to satisfy a biologist when actually the answer won't necessarily be critically dependent on it. So we've got schemes for the vasculature where we do include elasticity. It's done at a slightly approximate level, but enables you to see the pulsatility of the walls and so on. So if you start talking about the heart, I've just been talking about the vasculature because that's what I'm fundamentally working on. The heart's a big challenge as well, but today those models have very good representation of the kind of material properties of the walls of the heart. Yeah.
All this simulation require a lot of computational
Yes.
power, consume a lot of energy. What is the environmental impact of creating virtual human or
Yes.
digital twin, and what technologies you see coming in the future which can actually lower that cost?
And again, this is a very important, relevant question from a societal perspective. If you run on Frontier, the system I described, that operates at around 20 megawatts in power. It's actually, for its size, it's relatively low in power consumption. So it's been built to minimize that, but it's still substantial. If you think of the power consumption of the human brain, that's about 20 watts. So there's 6 orders of magnitude difference there. And that's typically what's going on. If you try to do digital simulations, they are power hungry. And ultimately, what we envisage is that you won't want to run, and I can't quite imagine in the near term, medics would actually be trying to run simulations on exascale machines. We need to be able to capture the outcomes of these things by short-circuiting all that energy consumption and time-consuming activity. One of the ways is using surrogates, which have become a term that's quite popular in AI and machine learning, which is if you've got a sufficiently large data set of cases where you can show that your simulations are being captured by this machine learning algorithm, then you would replace the simulations by machine learning. And when it's doing inference, going back to what I said earlier, after all the training is done, the calculations are almost instantaneous, so they don't use much energy. What's not understood, and I have to be clear about this, is in AI, it's extremely energy hungry itself in the training activities, and that's often not understood. It's a big effort to get all the data and to do the training of these models, so-called. And in fact, with the latest kind of thing that everyone's aware of, the large language models like ChatGPT, which just take enormous amounts of data. I mean, these are literally 3 or more orders of magnitude more power hungry than supercomputers are. And going into the future now, that's one of the big worries about that approach, that we can hardly understand how we're going to provide the energy to do it. There's one answer that could be deployed, which is to make much of computation analog in the future rather than digital, because analog computers used to be the way we did calculate things before the end of World War II, for example. With the development of the digital computer, analog has faded away. But there are problems where digital computers actually can't solve them anyway. We need to look at analog computing, and its energy profile is far, far lower, as evidenced by the brain, which is an analog entity, versus digital ones. So for me, yes, you have to pay attention to all of those things. Otherwise, you have like the weather forecast and climate prediction on very expensive supercomputers that are actually contributing to the problem they're trying to solve.
Right. You also worked recently in the quantum computing field. And can you compare the evolution of this field technologically to the classical computer? Like, what is your prediction? Like, will we see a more kind of user-friendly quantum computing coming to us in the next 5-10 years, or it's well beyond that?
Your question is very apposite and appropriate, because it's a bit like all these things we're talking about, digital twins, AI, quantum computing, get a lot of hype behind them. They sound great and exciting. And the danger is people make extravagant claims for them which can't be met. And then there's a backlash. And you're almost hinting at that because you clearly recognize the limitations. I do very much as well. The difference between what we do and what many people do in quantum computing from a scientific point of view is we actually get onto these quantum devices and use them. There's a lot of stuff, you could call it vaporware, theoretical papers. I mentioned people publishing theoretical papers in physics that have no connection to the reality of the devices. But our work is very much connected to that. And I know really what the limitations of these so-called NISQ-era machines are. This is the noisy intermediate scale of quantum devices. They suffer so many restrictions to do with noise and error-prone computation that most of the effort we dedicate is to sort of mitigating the errors and the noise as much as we can on the one hand in the hardware, and on the other trying to actually minimize the amount of qubits we use for calculations. This seems a bit silly unless you understand the limitations, because if I'm working with Frontier, I want to use all of the nodes on the machine. But the problem is the noise and error is so large that you can't really get good calculations. Again, it's sort of a fidelity issue there as you increase the number of those qubits. So that's the controlling issue for us. How many qubits can we actually put together and still get a signal? Because we really need, it doesn't sound like many, but for the calculations that might be relevant for drug discovery, I'd say of order 20 qubits actively working together. Today, the biggest calculation we've been able to report, which does something interesting scientifically, is 5 qubits. And but we are seeing a way forward now, which suggests that perhaps in the next 5 years, we could be harnessing hundreds of those things, and that's still in the intermediate scale. The longer term idea of the hype is we'll get it beyond this NISQ era with the noisy devices and genuinely have the power of very large numbers of qubits. But for my money, if I were a betting person, I'd say you could be talking of 20 years or more before that type of thing happens. But I think some of the things we're doing now are just on the edge of being able to show that we can use those devices to do something we can't get out of a a conventional computer. And that for me is when it starts to become really interesting, because we're solving scientific problems that people who aren't interested in quantum computing become interested in, and they realize they need this technology to support it.
You also did a quite interesting work in this verification and validation, and even have a specific software correctly available. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, this goes back to our conversation a few minutes ago about validation and actionable decisions that we want computers to be able to produce, because experimental results sometimes are subject to uncertainties and people can't reproduce them. In computational work, reproducibility is a big issue. So this is if you like, a program to equip simulations with certification that what comes out of them, certification that others will rely on, that what comes out of them is going to be actionable, meaning you can rely on it and you can take some steps out of it. So we have had to develop, and it's all open source software, so it can be used for any type of application, not just these medical cases. The validation that does do what you said at the beginning, checking whether the simulations agree with experiment. That's the ultimate arbiter for scientific objectivity, really, and meaningful outputs. But there's also verification. Verification is about checking that your mathematical representation in the computer is actually describing what the system you started out with was, which would typically be pencil and paper set of equations. So there's that. And then this important thing called uncertainty quantification. In the model, you typically have quite a lot of parameters that represent things that could well be personal to someone in a heart simulation or blood flow. Those parameters are meant to represent the properties that are relevant to that individual. And you need to be able to know whether uncertainties in those parameters, again, going back a bit to what the experimentalists can tell us that we use, how sensitive the predictions are to those uncertainties. And it can be, in some cases, that uncertainty can be very large. We have examples of that in the pandemic with COVID, where if you do this analysis with our software, you can show small uncertainty in some of the parameters for the model lead to predictions of death rates which are hugely uncertain, like inflated to the tune of 300%. So that means we know the predictions aren't very reliable. This is the sort of thing we can supply that tells you whatever area you're in, if you can rely on the outputs. And I should just add that this whole area is really key to regulatory authorities taking up in silico medicine, what we're saying. So the FDA is easily at the world's forefront in trying to implement in silico medicine. They see many advantages, but they need a regulatory framework such that if, say, I or anyone else develops a method that could be used in drug discovery or some therapy, that it is actionable and doesn't depend on what I say or when I did it, but everyone who also implements it will get the same answer. So this is really important in the medical area, but it's also fundamental to how we do science.
In top journals now, when we publish, most of them actually require you to also submit or upload the raw data to other people. So to what extent this is also becoming a norm for the computer science journal?
Oh, it's definitely exactly as you say. Increasingly, you must supply data that's available. Not all the journals do this, and so there are anecdotes I could tell you. But Nature, which is one of the leading journals, it's not just Nature as the headline journal, but it has this huge stable. In the last 5 years or so, created a new journal called Nature Computational Science. That is very strongly along the lines that you're describing, that you absolutely must have everything open and available and tested, etc. There's a paradox there in our domain, for example, with the main journal called Nature, which still does sometimes publish papers which don't release the software. The most egregious example of that recently was in the last 4 months, where DeepMind from Google was allowed to publish AlphaFold 3 without disclosing the source code. And that shows that despite everything they say in the journal, they're totally inconsistent in their policies. And that for as long as they do that, there are going to be big questions involved.
I see. Quite interesting. I think we're approaching the end of our time, but I have one more question to ask. I think early, maybe almost 20 years ago, you did some research on the self-assembly of RNAs. And that was 20 years ago. I think origin of life is the most important questions to us all. How did it evolve? It's still a miracle. And with all this computer power, I'm not sure you kept up with this field, but are we getting closer to understanding how the actually RNA self-assembly and RNA code then gets now to the protein coding? And do we have models which can actually demonstrate how it can happen in a time frame which is consistent with the biological evolution?
So it's true. I was active in that field of the order of 20 years ago. It's still a bit similar to other things I do, that I got involved in it because I was developing methods and theories that could be used for what you can call nonlinear self-replicating systems that have interesting kinetics in them. Then I found that the applications could be made to the origin of homochirality, the handedness of peptides and proteins as they're produced. It all comes down to nonlinear amplification, essentially. So if you have favorable kinetic properties of certain of these nucleotides as they start to form, they can, in a mechanistic scenario, in certain circumstances, then overwhelmingly get produced at the expense of everything else that can't reproduce as fast. So that picture is there, and it's a theoretical thing, pencil and paper, and there's still problems for the experimental scientists to set up scenarios which are the Darwin's sort of warm puddle that would actually clearly show that to be the way life got going. So the debates are still open there. Most of that community historically has been experimental, so it's more like this biological thing I'm describing and less influenced by the theory and modeling. In the longer term, and now they've begun to realize that's important. The problem is with the origin of life, and I totally agree with you, it's something that everyone should have an interest in understanding. It's absolutely fundamental to everything that's followed. Sort of a one-off event, and there's no other immediate empirical evidence for it, and somehow we got to where we are. So there's a lot of options still available for testing. Theory is becoming more relevant to it, but it hasn't advanced at the speed that I would like to see it having done.
I think there is a room for young scientists to go in this field.
Emphatically, yes. Strongly support that.
Do you have any advice to the young people who wants to enter in the field to the multi-scale computer modeling, and any advice to those?
The thing that I found myself doing is incredibly interdisciplinary, and at all sorts of levels, like the domains that I work in have to be bridged, and multi-scale is very important to that. If we're trying to build models of human or even complex materials, we can't just dwell in one area and be experts, but that's how the academic world tends to still operate. You really need to be able to work across those domains, but it's really challenging. And in the end, it's got social dimensions because you tend to have to collaborate with other people who have complementary skills and understand each other and make things work. So that human factor can be easily neglected when people write about how to deal with these problems. So we need more interdisciplinarity and encouragement and education and training in that sense. And from the medical area, with the talk I gave here 2 days ago, it was remarkable how many young people came up to me afterwards and said, I'm really interested in this area. I've got a background in medicine. How do I continue with this? And that's the challenge for the medical community. I alluded to earlier. I don't think their education and training is quite right for what we're doing. They need to have a better understanding of some aspects of modeling and simulation. I can't champion this field. We need to see qualified medics advocating these methods, and that does require different forms of education and training than are typically available anywhere today.
We are approaching the end of our fascinating talk. I am very grateful for all the insights and all the knowledge you shared with us. You're always welcome at AUA. Hopefully we'll have some joint project with our faculty and the students. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you.